Welcome to the Knoxville AAR. Please forgive my voice, I'm still recovering, but I believe you guys have dealt with this delay long enough. With that said, this will be a complete umpire AAR of the Patria Granda Frontier Defense, ran by yours truly, Darter. And with that said, let's get right in. This right here is the map. It is a map of Knoxville, obviously, set in an alternative universe of 1813, with the Spanish and French. There was a bit of pre-battle action, with the French scouts arriving in the north and combating with the Spanish very, very small garrison in Knoxville last night before they went to sleep. And here is the unit composition of both teams. In red circled are the militia. The French briefing is as follows. It's fairly simple. They have the job to take Knoxville and a couple other secondary objectives. Those being hold it until sundown, and it gives them a bit of direction where the Spanish will come from. The Spanish have roughly one regiment in Knoxville, and they know their force contains militia. And next we have the Spanish briefing. The Spanish briefing tells them the following. They have their force split into two, and they must hold Knoxville. They have a regiment in Knoxville that is presumably have rested, and the location of the French force is likely to be coming from Menardville. And then we have the rough deployment areas. Each force was allowed to deploy a small cavalry force in the respective areas of Clinton and Rockford. These areas were pretty clearly red herrings and would not have really aided both teams. And I'm actually pretty proud that both teams were able to spot this and did not get caught off by this weird deployment mesh. Speaking of deployments, here are the French and Spanish deployments. The French basically decided to make a giant death column on the North Road without accounting for the multiple roads and the weird terrain. The Spanish had it a lot easier, to be fair, but this was also because their force was split in two. They also had a much longer road to get there. Here's the French traffic jam for your information. Indeed. Now that we have the deployments, here's turn one. The French send their cavalry up ahead of their forces along with the Spanish. Both of these cavalry forces contain their CICs, which would lead to a major breakdown in communication for basically the entire game. I don't recall seeing that many dispatches, and it really hurt both teams. Now, a quick note, we would soon see by turn 2 and turn 3, respectively, the damage the cavalry had on the roads. This was not a activity the players could account for, but it was worsened by the lack of communication on both teams. Nothing much for turn 2. However, on turn 3, you will soon see the damage the cavalry and artillery are causing on the roads, and we get to see the first interaction between Saint-Larc and the French CIC, which would escalate rapidly as the cavalry and Spanish began opening fire, and by turn 4, we see the death of the French CIC in a duel, which is suboptimal. My quick note to never would be, if you're going to duel, I would not do it as a CIC due to the necessity you pose to your team. However, your team, as is known to the players, has managed to carry on effectively. Meanwhile, the French team does a wonderful job dealing with the traffic jam in the north, and Saint-Larc is doing a fantastic job in his garrison defense, especially since he did just kill the French CIC. The Spanish continue their very long and very boring march, which I do apologize for, but remember, to a reminder of those Spanish players, you were some of the most valued members of any team. Turn 5 continues as Saint-Larc does a wonderful job maintaining his line and shredding the French cavalry. However, the French cavalry does manage to reposition, and the French infantry is rapidly approaching. Turn 6, the French cavalry and CIC have arrived in Knoxville, and the Spanish CIC immediately starts reprimanding Saint-Larc in all of his decisions and overriding him multiple times. This leads to a major confusion, which the French, having their infantry arrive, will soon exploit, as meanwhile the Spanish cavalry sets very far on the left side of the line, leaving a very exposed line, which Saint-Larc, to his credit, did notice. However, this was again overridden by a CIC who was obsessed with the high ground. The Spanish continue to lengthen their line, even deploying some infantry very far over on the left. Meanwhile, Saint-Larc gets in a church tower and does get a really good view of the battlefield. However, due to some oversight, he did not seem to understand that as a commander, he doesn't complete the line, which would be a fatal mistake, as in the next turn or two, it would lead to the complete collapse of the Spanish lines in Knoxville. The French, meanwhile, continue their infantry advance, and the French cavalry continues to pin the Spanish cavalry in place. The French and Spanish cavalry continue their deadly staring contest as the French Grand Battery opens up fire. Meanwhile, the French immediately recognize the gap in the Spanish lines, and using their regiment in the rear, they set up a marching assault column ready to obliterate the gap in the Spanish lines, with the goal of disconnecting them from reinforcements. Meanwhile, the French main line is ready to launch a very costly frontal assault against the Spanish. At this point, the Spanish lines have not recognized, between the St. Lark or the CIC, the major peril they're in. The Spanish cavalry is heavily pounded by the Grand Battery, as again the staring contest continues. Meanwhile, with the infantry, the entire Spanish regiment in Knoxville has almost already been encircled by the French forces, with only able to retreat either into the river or into the east. However, major combat has not truly begun yet. There is still time to launch a possible breakout, if St. Lark realizes, which he doesn't. Major urban combat begins as smoke fills the entire city, as the Spanish manage to break through in the right. However, their left collapses into a dust, as the French forces led by Falcon lead a devastating infantry charge into the Spanish left flank, which would be the west in this case. This would lead to the complete devastation of the Spanish forces later on, as defeat for the regiment becomes just a matter of time. The French players, though, do not recognize this, and some sound the horn of retreat only to be overridden by their CIC, who knows the attack cannot be called off at this rate. Much credit to him. The Greenwood curse continues as the French bayonet charge the Spanish artillery wagons, which the artillerymen in panic throw torches in and run. This would lead to a devastating explosion, disorientating everybody in Knoxville, allowing the Spanish to retreat from combat, if only temporarily, as the French wait to reform their lines and count their losses. This has given the Spanish a good bit of delay, but at the cost of the entire garrison's artillery force. The smoke settles as the forces respectively reform. Meanwhile, in the west, the Grand Battery has now completely devastated the Spanish cavalry, along with a devastating and very costly charge, mind you, from the French cavalry, leaving both cavalry forces combat ineffective. However, the Spanish cavalry force is removed entirely from the map in a mound of shrapnel. The apex of the battle begins as the Spanish forces have now arrived on the outskirts of Knoxville. As Desert Fox begins setting up lines and skirmishing in the city, we will soon see if the Spanish can still recover. The French forces are very exhausted from their offensive, as well as the long march here, which both sides have to endure. This is the question: can the French consolidate their gains and defeat the Spanish? The French managed to score a debilitating blow on a Spanish battery, knocking out its ammunition cart, leaving it only half effective. The fighting begins in the west of Knoxville to intensify as skirmishers are deployed. Overall, the final battle is soon to begin. The final battle begins. The skirmishing of the Spanish has prevented the French from being able to properly rest and absorbed much of their artillery, which is desperately needed for the Spanish force at this time. The French by this point have almost a 3-1 artillery advantage, which is tearing the Spanish lines apart. The skirmishing is probably the only reason the Spanish are still in the game. It is only a matter of time, though, and the Spanish need to act aggressively in order to overcome the French artillery advantage, which is soon to become insurmountable. The Spanish, meanwhile, play it very passively, withdrawing slightly to allow their artillery to recover. The truth is, though, the Spanish artillery truly isn't in play anymore. The French artillery advantage is soon to become insurmountable in all regards. For lack of a better phrase, there is no time to waste at this point. But Desert Fox, in a combination of lack of the full picture and lack of communication, has overlooked this fact. E. Lyman, the French cavalry commander, meanwhile gathers the last of his force and launches it on a suicide mission to try and delay the Spanish force, which works splendidly. This small pinning attack will effectively ensure the defeat for the Spanish, as they overreact to this attack and will deploy a battalion or two away from the front line. Desert Fox, meanwhile, still is playing fairly passively before launching his final offensive next turn. The Spanish launched their final attack, only to be torn to shreds by nearly a mile-long battery of supreme French artillery, which devastates the entire front line. The Fox attack, meanwhile, goes splendidly, almost breaking through the French flank, only saved by the location of the French commanders. The truth is, at this point of the game, is effectively lost for the Spanish. The Spanish line reforms in the north and launches a second offensive directly into the already aimed French artillery, which again fails. Meanwhile, the Spanish Desert Fox attack disintegrates as Saint-Larc, being Saint-Larc, decides to kill everybody by bringing all of his artillery wagons to the front and committing suicide by detonating every last one of them. The critiques. As far as critiques go, this goes for both teams, but dispatches. Your cavalry barely talked to your infantry the entire game, and would have been a lot more effective if they had done so. They could have sent out a lot more scouts and located the Spanish forces a lot earlier. Meanwhile, as far as tactics go, you were fairly tactically sound. Your encirclement of the Spanish force was fantastic, but you could have possibly lengthened your front line a bit earlier to envelop the Desert Fox attack. But again, that's nitpicking. You guys won, not much to critique. Other than, of course, your CIC, who really shouldn't have dueled. A 2IC, that's, again, suboptimal. The Spanish critiques. First off, to Desert Fox and the rear line. You guys did fairly well the entire game. You didn't get to see much combat, but I definitely could feel your guys' exaggeration and your depression when you learned about the defeat of the Spanish in Knoxville. Desert Fox, you could have played a bit more aggressively, but I can understand your position. Having already seen your CIC defeated, you were probably fairly disgruntled by that. Saint-Larc, your defense of Knoxville went about as good as it could until you made a simple tactical blunder. You didn't realize your lines were in the condition they were, and you got overrun. We've already talked about this in the Discord, but just know that was your major blunder. To the Spanish CIC, you didn't talk enough to help your team, and you then talked too much in the wrong areas as far as tactics go. The high ground didn't matter as much as it seemed, and your choice to lengthen the Spanish line to the degree you did contributed a good bit to the defeat. It was no one person's fault for the defeat of the Spanish. If I had one note for both players of the team, it would be more dispatches. More dispatches always help, and communication is the only way to maintain integrity. With that said, thank you guys for listening to me yap about my first game as umpire, and I hope all of you had an amazing time playing. I sure did, and I'm pretty sure you did too. Also, more exploding ammo wagons for everybody.